A modern map of the world. Go ahead. Close your eyes if you have to and just zoom in on Britain.
Right, it's pretty small.
Yeah, you see
We
this
face the
relatively small
storm,
island nation
resolute in
sitting
the belief
just off
that
the
this
coast of
island
Europe. It's
and all it
packed, it's
represents
contained. But if you
would
flip
prevail.
back, just a single century, the borders of that single entity didn't end at the English Channel.
Not even close.
No.
Yeah.
They covered a quarter of the globe's landmass. They ruled nearly a third of the entire human population. And looking at the sources we're diving into today, the wildest part isn't just that a tiny island pulled this off.
Yeah.
It's that, at least in the beginning, it wasn't some grand royal master plan. It was basically a series of, well, chaotic corporate startups.
It really was. I mean, we look back at this empire on which the sun never set, and we just assume it was engineered by monarchs sitting in castles, right? Pointing jeweled fingers at maps.
Yeah, like some giant game of Risk.
Exactly. But the foundation of this whole globe-spanning state apparatus was completely decentralized. It relied on a dual-engine mercantile trade and naval supremacy, and it was driven heavily by private venture capital.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because to really understand how they eventually hit that global peak, we have to start with those messy experimental origins.
That's for sure.
The sources mentioned that England had already dominated Wales and parts of Ireland, but Scotland was still fiercely independent. So England starts looking outward. How do they actually take that first step across an ocean without completely bankrupting the crown?
Well, by outsourcing the financial risk. I mean, the earliest blueprint for colonization wasn't even across the Atlantic. It was the plantation of Ulster in the early 1600s under King James.
Okay, in Ireland.
Yeah. They essentially moved Protestant settlers from Scotland and England into Northern Ireland to establish control. And the men who managed that project, they later used it as a direct template for the New World.
But wait, even before King James, didn't Queen Elizabeth III hand out commissions to famous explorers, people like Sir Francis Drake or Sir Martin Frobisher? Were they actually building colonies at that point?
Not really. They were claiming territories on paper and mostly just raiding Spanish ships. But following up with an actual functioning settlement was an entirely different logistical nightmare.
Right.
When they tried to establish a permanent foothold, like the Roanoke Island colony in North America back in 1585, it failed spectacularly.
Roanoke, is that the settlement where the colonists just mysteriously vanished without a trace?
The very same. And mysteries aside, failures of that magnitude are incredibly expensive.
Oh, I'm sure.
The crown just couldn't afford to keep absorbing those kinds of losses. So the strategy shifted. They moved toward granting royal charters to joint stock monopolies, like the Levant Company in 1592 and the East India Company in 1600.
So the crown provided the legal monopoly and private shareholders provided the cash. Our sources actually outline 3 models for these early settlements, and this is where that startup analogy really crystallized for me. You had the crown colony, which was run directly by the monarch's people.
Right.
Then the charter colony, which gave the colonists themselves a bit more political liberty. And then the proprietary colony, which was governed by individuals representing the shareholders of a commercial enterprise.
Yeah, that third one is key.
So if one of these proprietary startups failed, the crown lost nothing, right? But if it struck gold or tobacco, the crown taxed it and reaped the rewards.
It functioned exactly like modern venture capital.
Yeah.
But with a massive geographical flaw.
The distance.
Right. You had a board of shareholders in London trying to micromanage a settlement thousands of miles away across this unpredictable ocean in an environment they fundamentally did not understand.
So you're relying on this laggy communication system of ships taking months to cross the Atlantic while expecting local councils to just strictly follow orders.
Precisely. And the sheer cost of it defending a colony, fighting off local populations, keeping the settlers from just, starving to death. It eventually overwhelmed these commercial enterprises.
The model just broke down.
It did. The proprietary model broke down under the weight of its own logistics. So it forced the crown to step in and absorb them, making them crown colonies just to keep the assets functional.
Okay, so England is slowly building this overseas network, absorbing the successful ventures. Meanwhile, Scotland, sharing an island, and even sharing a monarch since 1603, but acting as a totally separate kingdom with its own economy, is watching England get incredibly rich.
And they want in.
Right. Do they just sit there, or do they try to launch their own startup colony?
Well, they absolutely try. And it leads to one of the most disastrous financial pivots in history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Scotland attempted a few settlements in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton and Carolina. All failed. But in 1698, they launched something called the Darien Scheme.
Darien Scheme.
Right. The strategic goal was actually brilliant on paper. They wanted to establish New Edinburgh in a territory they called Caledonia, basically a colony on the Isthmus of Panama.
To control the overland trade route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
Exactly.
That sounds like they were trying to build the Panama Canal centuries before the technology existed.
They essentially were.
But how on earth did a relatively poor, independent Scotland fund an expedition to Central America?
By liquidating a terrifying amount of their own domestic capital. The Scottish public got caught up in this speculative fever. They raised funds that amounted to roughly 1/5 of Scotland's entire wealth.
Wait, I have to pause here on behalf of anyone listening. 1/5 of a nation's entire wealth dumped into a single colonial startup.
Yes, and every penny of it vanished into the jungle.
You're kidding.
No, it was a catastrophe. When the colonists arrived, they were immediately decimated by tropical diseases they had no immunity to. There were severe food shortages, and then coordinated attacks by Spanish forces who, already claimed the territory.
So they just got wiped out.
Pretty much. Only a few hundred out of about 2,500 survived. Scotland was plunged into a profound, catastrophic financial crisis.
So you have a completely bankrupt nation sharing a border with an increasingly wealthy neighbor. What's the play there? I mean, you can't just declare bankruptcy and ignore the people right across the river.
You merge.
Ah.
The 1707 Acts of Union. Driven heavily by this economic collapse, Scotland agreed to unite with England to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Primarily, they just needed to gain access to the massive profits of the English colonial enterprise to bail themselves out.
And what did England get out of it?
Well, England wanted to secure a Protestant monarchy after the Glorious Revolution and ensure Scotland wouldn't ally with a rival like France.
Talk about cause and effect. A failed real estate investment in Panama essentially creates the unified Great Britain.
It's wild.
And once they combine their resources, this new British engine seems to just steamroll the 18th century. Our sources mention a string of wars: the Spanish succession, Austrian succession, the 7 Years' War.
Right, and with every victory over a European rival like France or Spain, Britain extracted massive territorial concessions.
Like what?
Well, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 is a huge milestone. They secured Newfoundland, Gibraltar, Florida, various Caribbean islands, and they captured Quebec, which effectively ended French colonial ambitions in North America by 1760.
So before we go further into the empire's growth, the sources keep highlighting mercantile trade as the true engine of this expansion. Just to ground this for you listening, this isn't just free trade as we think of it today, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. It was an incredibly extractive system. Mercantilism is an economic theory based on the idea that global wealth is finite.
Like a pie, there's only so many slices.
Exactly. To be powerful, a nation has to export more than it imports, basically accumulating gold and silver. Colonies didn't exist for their own benefit. They existed purely to serve the mother country.
That they just funneled resources back.
Yes. They provided cheap raw materials and then were legally forced to buy back expensive manufactured goods from Britain. It was a closed, heavily taxed loop.
And we really cannot talk about this closed loop without confronting the darkest part of the machinery. The sources are very clear that the wealth pouring into Britain during this era was deeply, deeply tied to the Royal African Company, which was created in 1660, and the brutal transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, that's the dark engine of it all. The mercantile system in the Caribbean relied on extracting immense quantities of sugar. And sugar is a notoriously labor-intensive crop.
Right.
To maximize profit, the empire utilized a highly lucrative, horrific system of enslaved labor. The sheer volume of wealth generated by those plantations heavily funded Britain's rising global dominance.
But the sources also note a massive shift happens in the early 19th century. Britain actually abolishes the slave trade in 1807, eventually the institution of slavery itself in 1834.
Right.
What changed the calculus for an empire that had literally built so much of its wealth on this brutal system?
The mechanism of change was really the Industrial Revolution. As Britain industrialized, their domestic economy radically transformed. The focus of British capitalists shifted toward producing manufactured goods in massive new factories right at home.
Okay, so making things rather than just importing raw goods.
Exactly. So the political power in Britain started shifting away from the wealthy Caribbean plantation owners and moved toward these new industrial factory owners.
So it wasn't just a sudden top-down moral awakening. The underlying economic structure fundamentally changed. The factory owners gained political leverage, which finally made it politically viable for Parliament to listen to the fierce campaigns of abolitionist groups.
Exactly. The economic necessity of slave-produced colonial goods diminished relative to the booming manufacturing sector. And that shift gave the abolitionist movement the opening they needed to finally achieve their goals.
Right, okay. So